He called me crazy so many times, I started to believe it. I lost track of what was real. Here's how gaslighting destroyed my confidence. And the one thing that finally broke the spell, the words echoed, a constant drone. You are losing your grip on reality. He twisted everything, every memory, every conversation, until I questioned my own name. I felt that familiar cold dread creep in, a chill that had nothing to do with the room's temperature, but everything to do with the sinking, nauseous feeling in my chest. My sanity was on the line, and I knew it, but I also knew I needed a strategy, a tactical way out of this labyrinth of mental torment. I needed a clear, decisive path to save my own mind. It started small, almost imperceptibly, a forgotten appointment that I was certain we had discussed, a misplaced item always blamed on me, even when it was in his hand moments before. I'd argue, present my case, but his conviction never wavered. You're imagining things, he would say, the tone laced with condescending pity, or your memory isn't what it used to be. Perhaps you need to sleep more or cut back on the coffee. At first, I dismissed it, attributing it to stress or my own imperfections. Who doesn't forget things sometimes? I told myself I was being too sensitive, too demanding. I was determined to be the forgiving, easygoing partner he constantly claimed I wasn't. I tried to mold myself into the person he claimed he needed, but the target kept moving. But the pattern emerged, insidious and relentless. Every disagreement became a battle for my own perception of reality. I remembered one afternoon vividly. We were planning a weekend trip upstate. I watched him input the exact dates into the shared digital calendar on his phone, saw the confirmation screen pop up, and heard him verbally confirm the reservation details with the hotel staff over the speakerphone. Later that evening, a friend called asking about the trip dates, and when I repeated the dates we had just confirmed, he overheard and looked at me with an expression of total bewilderment, then feigned genuine concern. I haven't even looked at dates yet, he stated, his voice even, calm, and maddeningly assured. You must have been looking at your own old calendar from last year. Why do you always invent scenarios and then try to push them on me? It's exhausting. I froze. I could still picture the specific font on his phone, the green check mark on the screen, the shadow of his hand holding the device. Yet, here he was, staring me down, making me feel like I was not only hallucinating, but that I was actively malicious for suggesting it. The confusion was physical. A wave of disorientation and cold sweat washed over me, leaving me unsteady on my feet. To protect myself, I started taking evidence, but covertly. After a particularly confusing denial about a shared debt, a significant amount we both needed to pay, I wrote down every fact, every detail, the exact time and date of our discussion, and stored it digitally, complete with a dated screenshot of the text message where he explicitly agreed to the payment schedule. I even emailed a time-stamped note to myself with the subject line, confirmation of Tuesday, 3rd p.m. conversation. A week later, when the payment was missed, I brought it up. He denied the entire conversation ever took place. That never happened, he said flatly. You invented that to create stress and financial drama. I think you might be projecting your own financial worries onto me. I finally decided to present the evidence, the screenshot, and the notes. I expected defeat, or at least a temporary retreat and a muttered apology. Instead, he just laughed. It was a short, sharp, terrifying sound, devoid of humor, a sound that cut right through my chest. Anyone can fake a text, or type up notes after the fact. You're getting really obsessed with proving me wrong. You need to focus on our happiness, not on these childish, self-sabotaging games. My stomach clenched, feeling like a fist was squeezing it tight. I realized the evidence wasn't the point. The goal wasn't to win the argument. The goal was to make me doubt the very tools I was using to keep myself sane. It felt exactly like standing on quicksand, watching the solid, factual ground beneath me disintegrate into useless dust. My internal world, once so solid and reliable, began to fracture under this constant assault. I started second-guessing every single thought, every decision, every feeling I had. If he said something didn't happen, maybe it truly didn't, and my memory was simply defective or unreliable. My friends would ask about my recent plans, and I'd find myself hesitant, unsure if what I thought was true was even real, or if I had manufactured the entire interaction in my head. The constant, gnawing doubt was a slow poison, an internal erosion seeping into every corner of my existence. I started actively avoiding conflict, not primarily because I feared his anger, though that was certainly present and intense, but because I was terrified of the sheer psychological confusion, the disorienting, isolating feeling of being manipulated until I couldn't trust my own mind anymore. The silence, the retreat, became a protective measure against the chaos he deliberately generated. I felt like I was constantly searching for evidence, for external proof that my memories were accurate. I developed an exhausting habit of internally fact-checking everything he said against my own notes, against external events, against common sense. If he saw me writing or checking my phone frequently, he'd use it against me, spinning the narrative. "You're obsessed," he'd say, always collecting data, like a detective trying to build a secret case against me. "You need serious professional help." The accusation stung, twisting the facts of my self-preservation efforts and feeding into my deepest, most fundamental fear, that I was, indeed, losing my capacity to reason and becoming unwell. The more I tried to hold on to reality, the harder he pushed me away from it, ensuring I was emotionally reliant on his unstable, dominant version of events. Then came the moments of false relief, the scattered crumbs. After a particularly brutal and draining argument, one where I clearly started to pull away, expressing my need for space and explicitly mentioning my option to consider an exit, he would suddenly shift entirely. A sudden burst of unexpected affection, a rare, genuine-sounding text. "Thinking of you. I miss you. I realize I haven't been my best lately." Or a truly unexpected moment where he'd sit down with me, put his phone entirely away during dinner, and ask me specific, thoughtful questions about my day, actually listening to the answers for a full 20 minutes. A second example, he'd buy me a small, cheap gift, a favorite candy bar, or a coffee from my preferred shop, something he rarely remembered to do, and leave it on my desk with a note that read, "Just because, you deserve it." These moments were so rare, so incredibly out of character for the everyday coldness and neglect that I clung to them. I wanted to believe they were a signal, a glimpse of the considerate man I imagined he could be. I would find myself overly excited, disproportionately relieved, just because he had remembered to put petrol in the car or had done a single load of laundry. I celebrated these basic decencies as if they were grand gestures of enduring affection and commitment. I was starved, and I convinced myself that a single spoonful of kindness meant the famine was over. But the pattern never held. The kindness was always fleeting, always followed by a swift, crushing return to his usual indifference, or, worse, another round of reality-bending accusations. I realized these brief moments of attention only occurred when I had expressed a satisfaction, established a small boundary, or when he sensed me actively pulling away and becoming emotionally indifferent to his moods. This was not connection. It was psychological maintenance. It was a trick, an intermittent reward, just enough to keep me hoping, just enough to keep me from severing ties completely. He didn't want to lose control, but he definitely didn't want to invest real, consistent effort. He just wanted to keep me available, warm, and compliant as a reliable source of validation whenever his ego required it. I remember one highly specific evening that absolutely crystallized the dynamic of the reversal. I brought up a significant concern about a specific boundary violation he had committed. It was a legitimate issue that required a sincere apology and a commitment to change. Before I could even finish my full point, he immediately began to tear up, his face crumpling with a manufactured sadness. "I can't believe you're doing this to me right now," he whispered. "I've been under so much pressure at work, and you know my difficult family history. Why are you always attacking me when I'm already fragile? You're so selfish, focusing only on your tiny problems when I might lose my job because of my workload." The conversation, which started about his inappropriate behavior, became instantly about comforting him. He flipped the script entirely, making himself the deeply aggrieved victim and me the thoughtless, cold aggressor. He even explicitly accused me of being controlling and demanding, the very behaviors he exhibited daily. I found myself apologizing for upsetting him, even though he was the one who had crossed the boundary in the first place. This was the rapid shift, the poor me pivot, where he moved from the person responsible for the problem to the person being harassed by my demands. It was designed to make me feel guilty, to silence my legitimate concerns by forcing me to focus on his manufactured distress. It worked nearly every time. I would walk away from these conversations feeling utterly bewildered, unsure how the conversation had flipped so completely that I was left holding the burden of his emotional state while the original, valid issue vanished entirely. I felt the intense pressure of having my legitimate anger immediately turned into corrosive, self-directed guilt. The rage was another core weapon, a volatile explosion used for control. It wasn't always shouting and noise. Sometimes it was a cold, cutting silence that felt more threatening and emotionally devastating than any scream or physical display. I saw it most clearly when I gently challenged his narrative or asked him to acknowledge a mistake. A simple, quiet suggestion that he might be mistaken about something, or a gentle attempt to hold him accountable for a small action, could ignite a furious blaze. The reaction was always hugely disproportionate, a massive explosion of anger over a trivial matter, like a small organizational error or a minor delay in traffic that wasn't his fault. The sheer magnitude of the reaction taught me quickly that there were invisible rules, his unseen, unwritten rules, and breaking them resulted in immense emotional cost. I developed an exhausting vigilance, learning to walk on eggshells, constantly monitoring his moods, carefully curating my words and actions to avoid setting off the explosive reaction. My body internalized this hypervigilance. I carried chronic tension in my neck and shoulders, constantly hunched. I developed a low-level, gnawing anxiety that never fully dissipated. I was always running complex emotional calculations in my head. Is this the right time to ask? Is he tired? Did that look on his face mean something? If I make dinner exactly the way he likes it, will I buy myself silence? The internal work was constant and debilitating. The switch was chilling. He could be charming, laughing, and engaging in smooth conversation with a total stranger or a coworker on the phone, and instantly transition to a cold, frightening monster the moment he hung up the call. This confirmed for me that the rage was not uncontrollable or pathological. It was a calculated tool used specifically and intentionally to maintain dominance and silence criticism within our shared space. I understood I was being used as a kind of emotional dumping ground for his internal turmoil. The rage was merely his method for purging his own shame and dumping the toxicity onto me. I was a vessel for his unresolved problems, and the emotional explosion was simply a technique for externalizing the intolerable feelings he could not integrate himself. Then came the grand, unrealistic promises that floated like empty mirages in the distance, the future faking. When I reached a point of absolute emotional exhaustion, when I openly considered leaving and started making concrete plans to depart, he would suddenly transform into the partner of my dreams, the person from the very beginning of the relationship. Grand, sweeping promises of a shared future would flow easily from his lips. Promises of finally going to counseling, of starting a new business venture together, of changing his controlling ways, of being the attentive partner I deserved. We'll buy that bigger house next year. I've already looked at the listings, he'd declare. Or, I'll finally start looking for a job where I don't feel so stressed. I promise. I'll be the husband you need. This is the last time I will disappoint you. He had a masterful, terrifying ability to mirror my deepest, most private desires, our shared dreams of travel, stability, and mutual support, crafting a picture of a perfect life that was designed to be impossible to resist. But the promises were always just that, empty commitments used to stall my departure. They were never accompanied by concrete, measurable steps. There were no actions taken, no solid plans made beyond the initial declaration. When I would gently ask, "Did you call the therapist this week?" he would deflect, saying, "Why are you always rushing me? I told you I will do it." These promises were a psychological debt scheme designed solely to extract more of my time, my emotional investment, and my loyalty now, in exchange for a massive payoff that would be perpetually postponed and would never materialize. He just wanted to buy more time, to keep me compliant and hooked until I retreated from my decision to leave. The cycle would inevitably repeat: huge promise, momentary emotional relief, and compliance from me, quickly followed by a crushing return to the neglect, indifference, and confusion. The cycle was a psychological treadmill designed to keep me running in place. The true breaking point arrived subtly, not with a massive, dramatic confrontation, but with a quiet, powerful realization that struck me while performing a simple, mundane task. I was staring at myself in the bathroom mirror, towel draped over my hair. A stranger looked back at me. My eyes held a flicker of permanent fear and deep exhaustion. My shoulders were permanently hunched forward, and my face looked hollowed out and uncertain. I saw a person who had stopped trusting her own judgment, her own instincts, her own memories, and her own feelings. I was a ghost, a shell of the confident woman I used to be. In that precise moment, a quiet but firm rebellion sparked within me. I was tired of feeling lost and confused. I was tired of living exclusively in his version of reality. I knew, with absolute cold certainty, that I needed to reclaim my own mind, my own self, and my own narrative. I started small. My first crucial step was radical. I consciously stopped trying to convince him of my reality. The moment he started twisting facts or vehemently denying conversations, I would simply state my own perception calmly, without trying to justify, argue, or convince him. That's not how I remember it, I would say, using a neutral, even tone, and then I would immediately and firmly change the subject or remove myself entirely from the conversation. I started seeking external validation for my perceptions, not validation of my feelings, but of the facts, describing the factual events to trusted, non-judgmental friends and family. Their clear-eyed, objective responses became a vital lifeline, a way to anchor myself back to verifiable, objective reality. I chose, definitively, to believe their consistent validation over his manipulative, intentionally confusing narrative. I began to radically accept that the crumbs he offered were not signs of genuine change in his character. They were merely predictable, calculated manipulations designed to maintain the status quo and keep me available. I stopped allowing these small acts to hold disproportionate weight, understanding that a small, fleeting kindness was just a temporary break in a harsh, bleak landscape, not the beginning of a new, healthy climate. I consciously raised my standards, recognizing that I was emotionally starved and that any healthy relationship offered a consistent, reliable level of respect and care, a full loaf, not just scattered infrequent crumbs. When he tried the poor me pivot, the attempt to turn my legitimate complaint into an emotional crisis for him, I learned not to justify, argue, defend, or explain. I acknowledged the manipulation internally, reminding myself, he is reversing the roles to avoid all accountability, but I did not allow myself to be drawn into comforting him or apologizing. I held firm to the original issue. If I had to address the concern, I would use the broken record technique, calmly restating the original boundary or concern without allowing his emotional deflection to steer the conversation off course. My truth was my unwavering shield, and I refused to lower it. His rage, once so terrifying and crippling, started to lose its emotional power over me as I understood its true internal source. It wasn't about me. It was about his profound inability to process his own deep-seated shame. I prioritized my physical and emotional safety first, knowing that complete, immediate disengagement was the only practical response to his emotional storm. I stopped trying to soothe him, argue with his twisted logic, or explain myself to him when he was in a rage. I refused to personalize his anger, understanding that I was simply a convenient, interchangeable target for his internal turmoil and an outlet for the negative, destructive feelings he could not integrate himself. As for the endless, empty promises of future bliss, the future faking, I stopped listening to the hopeful words and started observing the cold, hard history. I chose to judge him exclusively by his consistent past and present actions, not by his eloquent, future-focused declarations. I assessed the quality of our relationship based on how it functioned today, at this moment, asking myself a definitive question. If the promised, imagined future never arrived, would I still choose to remain in this dynamic? Dealing with its constant problems and emotional costs, the answer, clearly and definitively, was no. I began to make my personal decisions based entirely on my own independence and verifiable reality, no longer allowing his empty, conditional promises to dictate my life choices or delay my strategic timeline for departure. Reclaiming my sanity was the hardest battle I have ever faced, a quiet, intense war waged within the confines of my own mind. It meant detaching completely from his chaotic, manufactured reality and firmly planting myself back in my own truth. It meant trusting my gut, my core, my immediate visceral reactions, even when he desperately tried to convince me they were wrong or flawed. It meant understanding his tactics not as unique, personal attacks designed only for me, but as predictable, pattern maneuvers of a deeply disordered personality. I learned to look for rock-solid, verifiable consistency, not for fleeting, random gestures. I learned that my feelings were valid, my memories were accurate, and my experiences were undeniably real, even if he denied them completely and loudly. The spell of self-doubt broke the powerful moment I consciously and unequivocally chose to believe myself above all else. I chose to trust my own mind, and that strategic decision gave me the undeniable power to leave and start rebuilding my life. Here is the strategic path to reclaiming your reality and strengthening your internal compass against these psychological attacks. First, you must develop radical acceptance. Acknowledge that those tiny, sporadic gestures of warmth or attention you receive are not genuine shifts in character. They are strategic, low-effort efforts to keep you emotionally tethered precisely when you are preparing to depart. They function as intermittent rewards designed to maintain your investment and hope with the absolute minimum energy required from the other person. You must choose to stop interpreting these small kindnesses as a turning point or a sign of positive change. View them strictly as temporary lulls in a difficult, cold environment, not the beginning of a new, healthy climate. Recognize that you are emotionally starving and you deserve a consistent, reliable supply of respect and affection, a full loaf, not just scattered, infrequent crumbs. Next, when confronted with accusations or a sudden dramatic shift in narrative, where they immediately cast themselves as the person being hurt, you must resist the urge to justify, argue, defend, or explain your position. Engaging in this way actively fuels their cycle and keeps you trapped in their manufactured, confusing reality. Internally, acknowledge the manipulation, telling yourself they are reversing the roles to avoid accountability. While you may acknowledge their words to remain calm and disengaged, you must not attempt to convince them of your truth. If the issue is vital and safe to address, calmly return to the original point at hand, using the technique of gently restating your core boundary or concern without becoming emotionally entangled in their deflection or crisis. When faced with intense emotional reactions that seem hugely disproportionate to the situation, understand that this behavior is primarily a protective armor against their own deep-seated shame. This reaction, whether it is explosive, volatile anger, or a terrifying, chilling silence, is strategically used to shock you into submission and effectively silence all criticism. Your safety is always paramount. If the rage escalates or includes any physical danger, you must remove yourself from the vicinity immediately. Do not attempt to soothe them, argue with their logic, or explain yourself while they are in this state. It only feeds the fire and reinforces the tactic. Understand that their overwhelming reaction is an externalization of their internal, unmanageable turmoil. It is about their internal state, not a direct or fair reflection of your actions or your character. Finally, you must become intensely wary of any grand promises of a wonderful future that perpetually fails to materialize. These promises are used to extract your present resources, your time, your emotional loyalty, or your money in exchange for a massive payoff that remains constantly out of reach. You must choose to judge individuals solely by their consistent past and present actions, not by their eloquent, future-focused declarations. Assess the actual quality of your relationship based on how it functions today, at this moment. Ask yourself the core question: if the promised, imagined future never arrived, would I still choose to remain in this dynamic, dealing with its constant problems and emotional costs? Maintain your independent thinking and avoid making significant, life-altering decisions based on commitments that have no concrete, measurable steps in motion. Your true power and your path back to sanity lie in trusting your own discernment and firmly grounding yourself in verifiable reality, no matter how hard they try to convince you otherwise. This journey out of the fog requires courage, not perfection. Every step you take to validate your own feelings is a victory. You are strong enough to see the pattern, and you're strategic enough to break it. If this story helped you put a name to the chaos you've been feeling, if it validated that knot in your gut, please hit the like button and subscribe. Sharing these stories helps us build a community of clarity and strength, ensuring more people can recognize these patterns and secure their own reality. I'm here to remind you that your strength is internal, and you have everything you need to trust yourself again. Keep pushing forward. I'll see you in the next one.